But we also want to go back to CSU Long Beach professor Jason Whitehead. Are you there right now, Jason?
I'm here.
There you are. Hey, welcome back. So let's last time we talked to you, we heard some reaction from Trump spokesperson Alina Habba talking a little bit about how, they think this is all unfair. And one of the things that was interesting that we talked about was, she compared the Biden administration to a dictatorship, saying that we're like Venezuela, like Cuba. Obviously, we're neither of those two countries, not even a little bit. From a political point of view, if you're running for re-election and you're trying to get that Latino vote, and get those people to vote for you, do you think this was more of a reaction or also kind of like an election push, like, hey, we're here for you as well?
Oh, definitely. This tracks a lot of the narratives that the Trump campaign has been putting out there for public consumption, as well as some of the narratives that have been generated by proxies, by groups that support President Trump. And that narrative is basically that, this is selective prosecution. They're comparing us, as you said, to a number of countries, Venezuela, for example, that are dictatorships, that are not free societies. But it's interesting, if you think about what's distinctive about the U.S. system of justice in comparison to some other countries that his spokesperson named, one of the most distinctive things that we are proud of in our country is the rule of law. There's a reason why, if you look at the indictment, and if you look at every piece of paper generated by this court case, it's going to say the people of the United States at the top versus Donald Trump. There's a reason why our court cases work this way, because the people of the United States have a right to know the facts. And when you obstruct justice, or when you're alleged to have obstructed justice, what you're alleged to have done is to get in the way of the people's right to understand the facts of any criminal charges that have been brought against a person, and then be able to, assess those facts in a rational way. That's the core of our system of the rule of law. And so if you're going to compare what President Trump is alleged to have done to what Secretary of State Clinton is alleged to have done, President Biden, Vice President Pence, who all had classified material in their homes, it seems like you're missing the essential element that separates the case from those few other cases, which really cuts to the heart of what it means to be a rule of law country. So it's interesting that narrative, I think, has been out there in the public eye for some time now. In fact, even going back to the 2016 and 2020 campaigns. And we're sure to see it in the coming weeks. That's one of the main charges against the Biden administration that Trump friends and allies have been levying. But I don't know that it will stick. I don't know. In fact, the people of the United States, at least, say 35%, have been strongly in support of President Trump. But in fact, President Trump and his allies have been losing politically for the last several years. They lost the Senate, they lost the presidential race, and they haven't won the popular vote in a presidential contest in several years, in several election cycles. And will this narrative help them to gain those votes back? I see how it will help with supporters in South Florida, with immigrants, for example, from Cuba and from Venezuela and other countries. I don't know that it will help in the suburbs, which is really where former President Trump needs to solidify his support.
Although his spokesperson was saying that this was all coming about to hurt him because he is the GOP frontrunner, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be hurting him. He still has 61% of support. And in some ways, it almost seems as though he's using these charges to really help his case here.
No question about it. That's his strategy. That's the plan. And that feeds right into the mindset and the narratives that are accepted by the core of his constituency. But the real question, that 61% who are pledged to support him right now, that 61% of likely Republican primary voters, is not a subset of the rest of the country. And in order to win the presidency, he's going to have to convince some other people, some people that don't buy into these narratives. So it's going to be, in part, the onus is going to be on Jack Smith and the rest of the prosecutorial team here to see how and whether they can counter some of those accusations, some of those larger sort of meta political accusations about the Biden administration, acting like a dictatorship. My sense of Jack Smith is that he's much more locked down than that. He's not going to get involved in these kinds of political, shouting matches. But there are spokespeople, there are other attorneys working with Jack Smith who could effectively counter these things, and that could actually play a role in turning the tide one way or another. It's one of those things that you don't ordinarily see in a legal case. You ordinarily see just a focus on the facts and the law. But again, we're in a historically unprecedented situation where these political dynamics are going to play a role in the legal case, and the legal case will play a role in politics.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the supporters that are out there. Trump did ask for his supporters to go out there and support him in what he calls, false charges, saying that he's not guilty. Does it surprise you that there were only a few hundred supporters out there? I mean, to some that might seem like a lot, but when you're expecting thousands of people, you remember what happened with January 6th and the insurrection. And then you fast forward to 2023, where he's facing federal charges. These are very serious charges. No president has ever had to face this. And he has an arraignment right now. Does it surprise you to see that the turnout was a little lower, or does it have to do with the fact that it's Miami? It's hot out there. Miami is a little bit more blue, but, it is turning a little bit more red as well. What are your thoughts on that?
It does surprise me because I think, the Trump supporters have a history of being zealots, right, for all intents and purposes. And, for the most part, they haven't really cared about things like weather and things like, how it's going to look on television or anything like that. They tend to be, much more focused on defending the president at all costs, right? And also, there is this broad national call that was put out. It was a very similar call to the one that was put out before January 6th. Be here on this day to support your guy, right? And the fact that if this reporting holds up and there really are only a couple of hundred Trump supporters rather than thousands of Trump supporters, it's possible. It's hard to say, but it's possible that, that could show a dampening of support, that could illustrate the fact that, the cumulative effect of one indictment after another, and possibly even a third indictment coming down the road in a couple of months because of what's happening in the state of Pennsylvania, the charges that could be brought against him for interfering with the 2024 election. I think what a lot of no Trump, never Trump Republicans and a lot of Democrats are hoping is that the cumulative effect of all of this news, this negative news about the former president, will suppress some of that support. It will diminish it over the course of time. It's hard to know whether the numbers that we're seeing today are a reflection of that, but that's certainly a long-term issue that we've got to keep our eye on.
Let's talk a little bit about the power that the judge has in this case. We know that a former Air Force captain was sentenced to 3 years for having classified documents. We know that the former president could face up to 10 to 12 years for having these top secret classified documents. However, the judge can actually say, he shouldn't get the 10 to 12 years. Let's talk about the role that Judge Cannon will play in all of this.
Yeah, Judge Cannon really has, there are a lot of things that get to be decided by the attorneys, things that are decided by, the defendant himself, who has to make certain choices about how they're going to proceed. But the lion's share of the decisions about how this trial is going to run are going to be in the hands of Judge Cannon. And as you say, the sentencing at the very end, assuming that he's convicted, will certainly be something that she has some discretion over. I'm doubtful about whether or not she would sentence former President Trump to jail time, and if she did sentence him to jail time, whether he would actually serve that time, mainly because of the constitutional and practical difficulties of having a president or a former president incarcerated, because presidents are entitled to Secret Service protection for the rest of their lives. That's a federal law. And so that practically becomes very difficult to put a person in prison and put them in the custody of, whatever prison officials are in charge of that facility, but then also have Secret Service involved at the same time. Also, constitutionally, if you think about it, let's assume that President Trump, that 61% of Republican voters hold steady. Let's assume that, he's able to make inroads into suburban voters and independent voters and is able to secure re-election to the presidency. And let's say the sentence is a sentence of incarceration. Constitutionally, I'm really doubtful about whether that's possible, whether it's possible to have a president who at the same time, is incarcerated. We've obviously never dealt with that situation, but you can imagine, the practical difficulties, the constitutional difficulties that would create. And my sense, given how friendly Judge Cannon has been to Trump, given some of the orders that she's made earlier, my sense is that, she's going to be thinking more about other kinds of financial penalties, but we don't know. I mean, that's just my speculation.
Yeah, our CBS reporter, Christian Benavidez, is there right now, and he made a comment saying that Kari Lake is there. She's a longtime anchor from Arizona, and she's a pretty big deal. She ran for U.S. Senate, she lost, and there's also been rumors that, if he does get that election bid, she could potentially be his running mate. Do you think this was all planned out, that Trump invited her to come down to kind of talk to the people out there? I mean, why do you think she was there?
I mean, it seems like she's been gradually kind of incorporating herself into that sort of outer ring of Trump supporters. Not so much an official spokesperson for the campaign. I doubt that, and I don't know, but I doubt that there was any coordination as far as the vice presidency being dangled. At this point, it's very early in the process to be talking about a vice presidential pick. But on Kari Lake's part, I can almost guarantee you that that's on her mind, right? She really wants to be in public office. She certainly has made statements that are some of the most extreme of any Trump supporter, even though she was a candidate for office. So we know that she doesn't pull punches, and that she's willing to be fairly outrageous and fairly kind of out of touch with the facts on the ground. And that's, to be not to be too not to be too antagonistic about it, but it seems like that kind of a personality is exactly the kind of person that Trump usually gravitates towards. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was more coordination between Kari Lake and former President Trump going forward. I suspect that this one was just simply her choice to come and support the president.
And he has asked his supporters to show up today, of course, outside of the courthouse. And we have seen dozens of supporters there throughout the morning. It has been mostly peaceful. Those supporters, of course, being met with some opposition. Again, the Miami police chief saying that they were prepared for 5,000 or 50,000 supporters out there. But we have not seen those numbers of people showing up. But the numbers for the president are still high as far as support goes for him. Of course, this is a historic day as the former president, the first former president to face federal charges for having those classified documents.
Yeah, right now we're looking at a live shot of the supporters there. As Christian Benavidez told us, it's hot, it's humid, so a lot of them taking shade, hoping to get a glimpse of Trump. Some may have seen him. There has been some people saying that he was waving to his supporters. But yeah, definitely a few hundred people out there.